Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to be focusing on why lighting, values and contrast are so important when painting realistic animals. Now the other aspect of this video that we're going to focus on is how to layer the paint in order to get that three-dimensional look of whatever the subject is that we are painting. Now the first thing that you can see here is I'm just using a standard round shaped brush and I'm just mapping in my lights and my darks. Now I haven't applied the white paint first because I need to get that down because it's the brightest colour. It's just purely so that I can break up the elements to my lights and my darks. I want to make this as easy as I can. I want to simplify that process. So if I can break that up into the main shapes that I see just by focusing on my values, then I feel that that makes it so much easier. Now if you've seen many of my other videos here on YouTube, you'll know that I put a lot of emphasis on my base layer stage. I'm not focusing on the exact colour at all, it's all about my lighting. Now when we work with acrylics, we do usually like to work with dark to light techniques because we have that ability to layer as many of our lighter values on top. It's always best to start off with your darker values so you've got maximum depth and then build up your midtones and your highlights. Now at this stage here, look at how I'm curving my brush strokes to replicate the shape of the ear. This is going to vary depending on the subject, but there shouldn't be any straight lines. You don't want anything completely vertical or horizontal. Everything here will have a curve to it. Now once I've got a fairly accurate base layer in here where I've hinted at the position of my lights and my darks, I'm going to start now reinforcing those midtones and the contrast. Now contrast is something I'm going to be speaking about a lot in this tutorial, and as you can see here I'm going back in with another layer of titanium white for the very bright highlight on the top of the ear. Now I don't normally do this, I would save titanium white for my brightest highlights in the eye, but this reference photo had such a strong light source that the highlights on the top of the ears were very bright, so that's why I've just gone straight in and kept that bright with the titanium white. So what I'm doing here is starting to reinforce those mid-tone highlights and start to build up that shape where the ear is more curved. So this is where we do have to make sure on areas like this that we are focusing on how that brush should be moved. Now it's at this point where I realised I needed to have a little bit more shape to the back of the ear. I had my bright titanium white highlight at the top, and in order to focus on that three-dimensional shape I need to reinforce more of my contrast. So what I'm going to do shortly is start to put in some more of my darker values. Now really, going back to this, what I mentioned at the beginning of the tutorial about how we work with dark to light techniques, technically I should have gone with a little bit more of a darker base layer first. I wouldn't have therefore had to have darkened up certain areas later on. But this is the wonderful thing about working with acrylics. It's very versatile. There are many ways to get to the same end, and if we do realise we need to make something lighter or darker, it's very easily achieved. So as I've just put in a little bit more of those mid-tone highlights, I'm now going to come through with a darker mixture and reinforce those shadows. Now look at how this has made a huge difference to how curved the ear looks. This is all through the lights and the darks. They are in the right place, that's very important. We want to be studying that reference photo closely. But I've achieved this three-dimensional look so far with no detailed. This is all about putting in my values. Now I don't mind if I spend 2 hours getting my values right for one area. It's far more important to me that I do that rather than worrying about the exact colour. Now I have a video here on YouTube and it's talking about how I adjust the colour of my paintings through the use of glazes. This is a wonderful technique to work with when using acrylics, and it takes out all of that colour mixing, worrying about the reference photo, the colours that we should be using at each stage. It completely eliminates all of that. And here is a prime example. I've just mixed a very warm, slightly darker colour for the lower section of the ear and applied that over the top. Now all of that was done with those glazes, so if you would like to watch that video that I've got available here on YouTube, I'll pop that in the description below. Now one thing I want to quickly mention about the use of glazes, which I do cover thoroughly in that video that I will link below, is that a glaze must be applied to a layer of paint that is completely dry. So you want to be making sure that all of that painting for the area where you're going to be applying the glaze is thoroughly dry. It shouldn't be tacky because that paint is then going to lift up if you apply the glaze on top. So that is just something that is very important. So it's at this stage there, as you see, I was just reinforcing some of those little details, the tiny hairs on the edge of the ear, and by doing that, that's helped to bring the ear closer to the viewer. This is something else that's going to help to build up that three-dimensional look and realism to the painting, as well as focusing on the importance of lighting and contrast. So there I've added a little bit more of a purple-blue mixture. That is all through the use of a glaze again. And then I can reinforce more of my highlights. Add another layer of lighter paint, wait for that to dry, and then I can adjust the colour with an additional glaze. Now, one thing that I do want to mention that is important is you can see that I'm starting to add some tiny hairs on the ear, the edge of the ear and so on. You want to add these details once you're happy with all of the layers underneath. Otherwise, if you do need to make changes, you then need to go back in and work around those fine details. It just takes a lot longer, makes the process a bit more fiddly as well. So you want to be making sure ideally that all of the layers underneath, closest to the skin, are painted first, get that done, and then you can add your final details on top. So I've got a little cropped close-up of my painting there. You can really see how this has focused so much more on the lighting, the highlights, the shadows, the way that they're curved, having all of that lovely subtle variation. The one thing as well, there are no harsh lines. Apart from the very edges of the ear, all of the transitions from light to dark are quite soft. So it's all about giving that rolled over appearance. Even at this stage now where I'm blocking in my base layer, I'm going to be focusing on making sure that there are no solid boundaries between the highlights and the shadows. There, I'm using that brush to blend that paint together to give me that softness. Now, I speak about this in the real-time tutorials on Patreon. This stage here, for getting that soft blended look, is not going to look pretty. This is something that we reinforce as we continue to layer. But at this stage, I do still want to try to soften it to some degree. Now, the wonderful thing about working with acrylics, they are such a versatile medium that if we do make a layer that we don't like, that isn't what we intended, just wait for it to dry and then paint over it. There really isn't anything that we can do that ruins that painting unless you put a hole through your canvas. So here, just trust the process, enjoy the process as well. That's a really big thing, and try not to overthink that. It's one thing that I think we are very guilty of as artists. We sit there focusing on one area at a time, expecting that after one or two layers it should look realistic like a photograph. It's all about building up that in stages. Now, blending acrylics is a trickier aspect of working with the medium, and that's why I do focus on this in my real-time tutorials on Patreon. You've got a few options. If you're working on large areas, you can use a fine mist spray bottle. That works brilliantly for that. If you're working on a smaller scale like I am here, you can use wet on wet blending techniques. You've got a damp brush technique. There are a couple of ways to get to the same end. And it's also very important to know when to let that paint dry and when you want to keep that wet. So that again, that's something that's going to really vary the sort of effect and how those acrylics are going to be working. So at this stage, look at how much darker this base layer is compared to the left side. So here, because this is in shadow, I did have to start off with a much darker base layer. Now, even if I do have to come back in with some darker glazes to reinforce those shadows, it's about noticing this ear is darker than the other. Again, all about focusing on the lighting, the light source, and the contrast. Now, if you are working from a reference photo that has a strong one-sided light source, it's very important to be aware with how bright your highlights should be. So for instance, with the back section of this ear, I don't necessarily want the details to be as light as the left-hand side. When we're looking at the reference photo, it's very easy when you're working on one area to think, okay, I'm now starting with my highlights and then I'm going to go to bright. No big deal with acrylics because you can just add a darker glaze over the top to tone those highlights down, but it is something to be aware of. I don't want to be adding too many lighter details to the back sections of some of those areas if it is in shadow. Now, there is a bit of an exception with lighting because if you've got bounce light, you're going to get some reflections in a dark area that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So this ear is actually a very good example of that. This highlight there that I've currently mapped in, that is a little bit brighter. It's almost as bright as the other ear, yet this ear is in shadow because the neck is casting that shadow onto this side of the ear. So it's all about noticing the reference photo with where the position of your highlights and shadows are. The lighting that's catching the lower part of the detail on the back of the ear That's bouncing off maybe from the giraffe's neck. So all of those things here are there for a reason. The position of the highlights and shadows are just as important as the values themselves. Now, because this ear is darker, it has less of those mid-tone highlights and variations. This hasn't taken as long to paint as the other ear, and that's okay, as long as I make sure that this ear has the right amount of time that it needs. So just because it's darker, I don't want to then rush through it and think, okay, just a few layers and then it's done. I still want to make sure that it's to the same standard as the rest of the painting. And then, as before, it's just about adding in those final details. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. If you would like to paint along to the real-time version of this, then it is available on my Patreon channel. You get the reference photo, line art and full material list. And I have also painted this with a voiceover while I'm painting, so there are no sections sped up or cut out. I do also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. So here is a photo of my finished painting, and you can really see how important the contrast is here, the lights, the darks, making sure that we're putting those in the right place to really build up that three-dimensional look. Now, the other thing that the real-time version of this does focus heavily on is the use of glazes to get that beautiful colour in place. You can see here that saturation, the lovely burnt sienna values, the yellow colours, all of these here, those orange tones, are all being brought in through the use of glazes. I didn't ever stress at any point of the layering process about mixing the exact colour. So I do hope that this has been useful, and if you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching.